Anyway, so if you're new with us, just know that this is not how it normally is. If you're new with us, just know that we're in the midst of becoming who we are. And that actually leads us into the next thing that I want to say. We've been in this series called Being Who We Are because we have been talking about our congregational values. And so if you're new with us today, this is actually a good Sunday to be here because this series is actually a good series to start with because we're actually spending these we've been spending these last few weeks and we'll spend the next few weeks talking about who we actually are. So this is a series about our identity. You may recall that in that first week, I talked about how our council, David Montgomery, Heather Logue, Liz Phillips-Jackson, Freddie Castillo, Marcelo Costilla, our council and the pastors have been working together in a collaborative, dialogical way to articulate what our congregational values are. It turns out we haven't done that in a long time, and so it was time to do it. Now, a lot of our values didn't actually change. I don't actually have really any new values, but we spent some time re-articulating them, all right? So maybe there's one or two that are just a little bit new, but everything is pretty much legacy, our history. But it's a good practice to go back and say, who are we? Particularly in this cultural moment, who are we? And so that's what we've been doing. So the first week, our first value was, anybody? Yeah, worship, right? Worshiping the true and beautiful God. And our second value we talked about last week was, anybody? Exactly. Yes, no, anybody? Loud and proud. What was our value last week? Balancing word and spirit. That's right. So our last week's value was a distinctly vineyard value. Like, how are we a church that welcomes the work of the Holy Spirit and balances that with the ballast of the rich scriptures, right? This week, we're going to talk about our third value, all right? So before we do that, I'd like to ask you a question, all right? So my question is, do you listen to podcasts? So this means yes, this means no. Anybody listen to podcasts? Yeah. So turn to your neighbor and tell them what your favorite podcast is. Tell them your favorite podcast. Like maybe you guys can grab it. And if you're sitting next to your spouse, turn to another person besides your spouse, all right? Yeah, I love that. Okay, so you guys listen to podcasts, great. How many of you listen to podcasts at normal speed? How many of you listen to podcasts at 1.5 times speed? Anybody? Yeah. How many of you listen to podcasts at 2 times speed? Anybody? Yeah, like me. I'm with you, Nathan. I listen to it at 2 times speed. So if I talk fast, this is the reason why. Because I listen to everything at 2 times speed. I listen to audiobooks. I love listening to audiobooks because I can listen to them at 2.5 times speed. So you may be wondering what actually sticks with me. Probably not very much, but I still like listening to them pretty quickly. So I'm talking fast because I listen to everything at 2 times speed. My wife is always telling me, everything you listen to is 2 to 2.5 times speed. No wonder why you talk so fast. I'm like, that's just me. Anyway, one of the podcasts that I've been listening to recently is a podcast put out by Christianity Today called The Rise and Fall of Mars Hill. Anybody have heard this podcast? Anybody listen to this podcast? Yeah, it's pretty apocalyptic, isn't it? So this is about like 9 or 10 episodes in, right? I'm about 9 episodes in or so. This is a podcast about the rise of this mega church in Seattle called Mars Hill, right? Pastor by a guy named Mark Driscoll, and its stunning fall. I mean, like almost overnight it vanished. About 10,000 people in Seattle called that church home. And if you've ever been to Seattle, anybody ever been to Seattle before? Yeah, one of the things that you notice about Seattle is pretty much the absence of anything religious when you drive around. Anybody ever notice that when you drive around in Seattle? One of the things that you'll notice, like you drive around here in Chicago, there's a church almost on every block, right? Next to the Starbucks, right? But if you go to Seattle, what you'll notice is a Starbucks and no church. It's a relatively new city, but it's a pretty irreligious one, and yet it had this massive church in the center of it called Mars Hill, right? Mars Hill, over 10,000 people called it home, and then overnight, it vanished, right? So what happened? Well, Mars Hill is a parable about what happens when mission becomes divorced from identity, right? So it's a parable about what happens when mission becomes divorced from identity. When the talk is not the walk, and insert any other aphorism about when people are not integrated, right? When people are not whole, when people are not like fully themselves, right? They say one thing and they do something else. This is a parable about what happens when a leader of a massive church becomes a celebrity. And the reason why that's harmful is because celebrity oftentimes can billow out in such a manner as to eclipse the local church. Of course, that's what happened at Mars Hill. You know, Mark Driscoll, the pastor, actually became, now this is the narrative of this podcast. I'm not an investigative journalist. I don't know everything that actually happened at the church, but at least the story that the podcast is telling is that celebrity became so big and so large in terms of Mark Driscoll that it billowed out beyond the local church and eclipsed it, right? And of course, when a leader does not preaches one thing and does not actually practice it, which is maybe what seemed to happen there, it's harmful, right? It's harmful. And I would add, take what happened with Mark Driscoll and take what happened at any number of churches here in Chicagoland when mission becomes divorced from identity, and you put that into the cultural moment that we live in, and I would argue that that becomes really, really combustible. So you take someone like Mark Driscoll, you take someone like some of the churches that have happened here in Chicagoland. I won't name them. You know what I'm talking about. When the walk doesn't become the talk, you take those, you put those together. But the cultural moment becomes highly combustible. Why? Well, in our cultural moment, who we are, as we've been talking about with our leadership, who we are becomes more important than what we believe, right? As the world becomes more postmodern, what we believe is not as important as our stories or our lives, right? So everybody's interested in hearing your story, or everybody's interested in hearing your life. But then you're like, here's what I believe. They're not as interested. Why? Because what we believe is relative, right? So my truth is relative to me, as well as your truth is relative to you, right? So what I believe, if it rests on truth claims, it almost becomes immaterial because we determine our truth for ourselves, right? So put that into the cultural moment, combustible, right? As our world is becoming more post-Christian, then a pastor not walking his talk just confirms people's suspicions about church. You know, it used to be when you planted a church in a community, people would go, oh, great, a church in our city. This will mean moral influence. This will mean good moral influence. This will be good for our kids. But no, people don't think that anymore. When a church gets planted in a city or in a community, people don't think anymore about like, well, that's actually a good thing. It just seems to be either neutral or maybe even harmful, right? And as our world becomes more post-secular, what happens at Mars Hill then becomes like evidence for a particular kind of story, right? And that story is that institutions out there are apostate. And the church is just another one of those. And so go look for God in other places. As our world becomes most post-secular, this is how we begin to think. This is how the world begins to think. And I just want to be clear. I know that these are big concepts. We'll talk about these concepts in a few weeks when we talk about our last value. Okay, so if you didn't get all of that, that's okay. You know, I'm talking at 2.5 times speed. You know, I'm trying to turn it down. You know, like if somebody's got the dial, you just turn it down. But we'll talk about this more when we talk about embracing the future. All I'm trying to say is that who we are is as important or more important than what we believe, especially in this cultural moment. When you have a person who preaches one thing and is maybe not walking that preaching, then that becomes a really big problem, right? Who we are is more important than what we believe in this current cultural moment. And of course, I don't believe that. I don't believe that who we are is more important than what we believe because we believe in the most wonderful being in the universe. Like our belief, our creed is the most hopeful thing in the whole entire universe. And so I don't believe that, but I do think that the burden of this cultural moment means that we got to be really careful about who we are, right? Who we are. Who we are becomes our mission. Who we are internally, who we are, like when we hold presence with people who disagree with us, who we are in the world. Are we doing good? Are we not doing good? Are we implementing God's intention on the world, or are we not? I mean, who we are becomes the mission. And Mars Hill is a parable about what we say and not who we are being integrated. Does that make sense? We don't want to be that kind of church. We don't want to be that kind of church. Like I said this in the first value. I'm not here to build my brand. So you can't find Ted Kim International Ministry. I mean, look, the lights aren't even working. You know, I mean, like, we're just, yeah, see? Some of you might say that's the devil. Well, it could be mercy. But look, clearly don't have things together, you know? I'm not here to actually, like, this doesn't embarrass me. I'm not here to build my thing. This is about the kingdom of God, right? This is about worshiping the true and beautiful God. This is about pointing people to him, right? You know, this is not about me building Ted Kid Ministries International, although that probably does exist. I don't know. It's not me, though. It might look like me, but it's not me, okay? And so we find ourselves here at a third value. Who we are becoming really important. Well, so who are we supposed to be? Well, I think the Bible is really clear. There's only one answer to that question. Who we are supposed to be is Jesus. We're supposed to become like Jesus, right? And we've talked about this a lot. Preach about this all the time. Becoming like Jesus, which is our third congregational value. So the first value, worshiping the true and beautiful God. The second value, embracing or balancing the word and spirit. The third value is becoming like Jesus. We talk about it all the time. So if you've been here for a while, you're like, oh boy, another one of these messages, right? Well, we're going to preach it all the time. Because we think that who we are, we believe that who we are is just as important as what we believe. And we believe that who we are supposed to be is Jesus. This is what Jesus said himself, by the way. Jesus was like, hey, as I have loved you, so you must love one another. That's what Jesus says, right? Jesus says, hey, as I have done this for you, you should do this too. And Jesus also said, hey, whoever believes in me will do what I've been doing. They will do what I've been doing, and they will do even greater things than these because I'm going to the Father, which is when he goes to the Father, it's a clear cue. He's sending the Holy Spirit. The Holy Spirit will empower us to do greater things, right? Of course, greater is very loaded, and we won't unpack that right now. But here's our third congregational value, becoming like Jesus. And we preach it every baptism. We preach it we preached a big series on it this summer, becoming like Jesus. How many of you are here for that? We heard lots of wonderful people preach, you know, not me, but just wonderful people preached on different spiritual habits of Jesus, right? We preached a message series, like Sarah's nodding her head because Sarah preached, you know. Hi, Sarah. Raise your hand. Those of you online, Sarah's over there. Okay, so Sarah preached the last message on simplicity and generosity. I mean, these are the habits of Jesus, right? And of course, in this series, we keep saying that becoming like Jesus is attached to a very clear how, right? How do we become like Jesus? Anybody? We become like Jesus by doing the things that Jesus did. That's right. It's very, very simple. Become like Jesus by following him, as Dallas Willard says, in the overall style of life that he led for himself. You know, we can become like Christ by doing the things that Jesus did. And what did he do? Well, we talked about that over the last year or so. And if you haven't heard any of those series, they're great. You can just go back to our website and listen to like 9 messages on different spiritual practices, spiritual habits, right? What did Jesus do? Well, he prayed. He fasted. He practiced generosity, stunning generosity, right? He practiced what we would call spiritual disciplines. We get spiritual disciplines from Jesus. Jesus is the one who did them, so we do them too. And as we do them, we become like Jesus. Listen, becoming like Jesus, we believe that becoming like Jesus is your highest good. This is my highest good. Becoming like the kindest, the most beautiful, the most truthful, the most irresistible person to ever grace this planet, we think that this is the best news for you and for me. We think that if we lead you in this as our mission to help you become like Jesus, we think that you're going to experience your highest good. And because he is fully God and fully man, we believe that when we become like Jesus, we don't become automatons or facsimiles or copies of him, because he is big enough, he is fully human enough to encompass all of our collective identities. We find ourselves as we become like Jesus. And that doesn't happen with any other person in the universe, by the way. We also believe that when we become like ourselves, or we become like Jesus, I should say, becoming like ourselves, becoming like Jesus, we also believe that is the highest good for our community, our city, right? So when we become like Jesus, what that means is that we are like Jesus in the world. And by the way, that was God's intention from the very start. that we would be carriers of the identity and mission of Jesus in everywhere we go. Whether it's the grocery store, our gyms, or whatever. Wherever we go, that is God's intention for us, that we could become like Jesus. So it's our highest good. It's the highest good of our communities. It's the highest good of our cities. It's the highest good of every society to which we belong. We believe that the most revolutionary thing that you can do, that I can do to change our world is to become like the one who walked this planet and gave himself for us. But one question that frequently comes up when we tackle this topic is the question of impossibility. So you're telling me become like Jesus. Great. I'm telling you the building doesn't work. I'm telling you, just think of this. Every time the building blinks, just think, yeah, truly, clearly, these people are about building their own kingdom. No, we're about building God's kingdom. Okay? All right. And if this is not too distracting, then we can keep going. All right. So here's the question. The question is, you are asking us to become like Jesus. Fine. There's no way. He's perfect. No way I'm going to do it. No way. No way. No way at all. It's impossible. You're telling me to change my character. I don't even want to try. Or I've tried before. I've tried to change my vices. I've tried to change my addictions. It doesn't work, Ted. Sure, you're up there, you're saying, hey, you should become like Jesus. That all sounds great. I'm going to just go home, and I know that's impossible, and I'm not going to live that way, which is kind of what happens, right? Becoming like Jesus doesn't feel hopeful. It feels like futile. Okay, well, let's just wait until we die, and then we'll be transformed, right? But that's not God's intention for you. He wants you to live life to the full now. So what do you think Jesus might have to say to us when we say, it's impossible, Jesus? How do we become like you? What do you think Jesus might say to that? All right, now, if you're new here and you're like, okay, what is Jesus going to say? And I don't really know my Bibles that well, so I'm like really want you to know. I really want to hear from you, Ted. What do you think Jesus has to say to us in this particular moment? Would you turn to your neighbor for a moment and just discuss that question? What do you think Jesus might say to you? To the impossibility of becoming like him, how do you think he might respond, right? You don't have to turn to your neighbor if you don't want to. But this is just one of those moments where maybe we could actually pause it. What might Jesus say to us? Hey, Jesus, becoming like you, it's impossible. So what do we do? What do we do? How do you think Jesus might respond? What do you think his response might be? Turn to your teenage son or teenage daughter. No, I'm just kidding. Turn to your neighbor and think about that. What do you think Jesus might say? Turn to your neighbor. We'll just take a few moments. I love this. Listen to you all talking. You guys all have the answer, right? The lights have finally turned off. Now let's talk about giving. I'm just kidding. I'm just kidding. I'm kidding. We can't even keep the lights on, guys. All right. Okay, all right. I don't want you to have to talk about this too long. What do you think Jesus might have to say to us? As we say to him, okay, we're supposed to live like you. All right, so what might Jesus have to say to us? Anybody?
My grace is sufficient.
Amen. I love it. My grace is sufficient for you. That's right. Anybody else?
Not on this journey alone. I'm with you.
There you go. I'm with you. Behold, I'm with you always to the end of the age. So you're not actually doing it alone. Great. Anybody else? Yeah.
Looking to the Father.
Yeah, look to the Father. That's right. Which he always says. Okay, one more.
I can do all things in Christ who strengthens me.
That's right. We can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. Well, listen, those are all great answers. I'm going to read one thing that I think he has to say to us right now, okay? So everybody turn your Bible to Matthew 11. We're going to look at verses 28 through 30. This is what I think he would have to say to us in the project of becoming like Jesus. And for those of you shrouded in darkness, maybe you can grab your phone. Again, the lights aren't working, so there you go. All right. Here's what he here's what I think he would have to say to us. Come to me, verse 28, all you who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest. 29, take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and humble in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy and my burden is light. So when we ask the question, Jesus, what would you have to say to us when it comes to becoming like you? I think this is what he would have to say. And if you're like me, the response is, are you kidding? Really? I've tried this before. So I understand that what you mean by yoke is a life led at your direction. So you hold the reins and I'm going, and you're saying that this is light, the burden is light. You're saying that? Yes, I think he's saying that. And I think he's saying that for 3 reasons, okay? I believe this is what he'd have to say to us as we think about becoming like Jesus. My yoke is easy and my burden is light. So what does that mean? It means 3 things. The first thing that I think it means, first thing that I believe it means is Jesus is saying something very pointed about the world. So he's like, you think that my yoke is hard? Take the yoke of the world. Take it. Jesus is saying, by contrast to the world, doing life like him, doing life with him is way, way easier than doing life with the world, right? And of course, the world that Jesus was talking to is the world of the Pharisees, the world of the Sadducees, the world of the Jews, the religious establishment who are basically saying, hey, when you get some spice from the store, you should tithe like 10% of that. I mean, like, talk about minutia, right? So you get your garlic powder from the store, you take it, you open up then you bring it, by the way, and then a little Ziploc bag, you bring it to church. You're like, oh no, what happened? I spilled it, And you go back, and then, by the way, it's not the last 10% either. Like, oh, I just have a little bit left. I can put that in the bag. No, you don't want to do that. We'll take the first part of it, and you come and then you spill it in the car, and then you're really glad because it smells really bad when you pull in the parking lot because we are across the street from a waste factory. So then you're like, oh, well, I guess that worked out. But it really didn't. So that's the world that they lived in back then, not with waste factories. But you know what I'm talking about, right? So religious minutia, our world is not like that, but it's not that much different. Our world is hard too. So since the 18th century, our world has been dominated by a Western Enlightenment idea. And what is that idea? The idea is that pleasure is your highest good. By the way, before the 18th century, people didn't think that. But the 18th century, they started believing that happiness, pleasure was your highest good. It gets darker and darker in this room, so I apologize. I think we'll be able to keep these lights on. But anyway, it gets pleasure, and unrestrained pleasure at that, unrestrained hedonism is every person's highest good. And that's the idea that runs through this world. How many of you know that? Like the God of this age is for you to be happy, for you to have pleasure, right? This is bad news, and it's bad news because for a variety of reasons. I don't have time to go into all of it, but part of what it means is it means no constraint. Part of what it means no restriction. No restriction, no constraint is really bad news philosophically, okay? It also means that when pleasure is your highest good, it also means that you are the primary agent of happiness, your own happiness. No one can decide for you what's pleasurable, right? Everybody feels pleasure in different ways, right? So all of a sudden, pleasure being your highest good makes you the primary agent of it, which is really bad news because how many of you have tried to fulfill your own desires? Right? When you try to fulfill your own desires, what happens? Well, you find out that it's a well and it goes really, really deep and you never get to the end of it, right? Ask any artist and you'll hear that freedom is actually found not in unrestriction or in limitation, but freedom is actually found in constraint. Ask any artist, right? A canvas is constraint. They feel freedom with the canvas, right? Songwriters are constrained by the form and structure of a workable song, unless they're Radiohead. Painters are constrained by the canvas, right? And the medium they're working with. Videographers are constrained by what can be expressed through film, right? The boundaries give us freedom. That's how it works. Boundaries give us freedom. So think about children, the freest creatures on earth. Do they thrive when there's no constraint? They do not. They must have structure. I know from personal experience. Structure, constraint, brings them freedom, lets them feel free, right? When I first came to the vineyard, I was a riot of all sorts of bad habits. One of those habits was compulsive lying. So this was in the 90s. I was a college student. I came to the vineyard. It always seemed easier for me to talk myself out of trouble, to avoid consequences. It always felt easier to lying and not tell people what really actually happened. So that actually became a habit that spun out of control. Pretty soon, lies were coming out of my mouth, and I was like, wait, let me take that back. And they would just come out of my mouth, right? So then when I first got here, I think within a couple of Sundays, Steve, our founding pastor, started preaching on getting free from lying. And he was like, you get free from lying by confessing your lies to everybody you lied to. And I thought, no, I'm not going to do that. But it felt like the heat lamp on me, which seems weird because there's no lights in the room, but there was the heat lamp on me that felt like it was 1,000 degrees, and I felt like, man, I have to do something about it. And as an Enneagram 3, I thought, man, I don't want to tell anybody that I lied to them, but I started doing it, and here's the funny thing that happened. I couldn't believe how free and light I felt. I no longer had to remember who I told the lie to because I wasn't telling lies anymore. And I no longer had to remember which lie I told to which person. I mean, I didn't realize that I spent so many of my waking hours worrying about who I lied to. But once I started confessing, once I started getting free, once I started confessing and started confessing my lying, I started to get free. This is the way that freedom within constraint works. Choosing Jesus' way might feel like constraint at first, but it leads to a light conscience. Folks, there's nothing heavier than a guilty conscience. Follow Jesus, get free. Follow pleasure, get addiction. Ask any addict, and they'll tell you, being an addict is not being free. So it's easier then. That's the easy yoke. Second reason why it's easy. I think that part of what Jesus is talking about when it comes to getting free and having an easy yoke is he means ease of flow, right? So here's what we mean by that. We mean that it's an easy yoke and that the actions of Jesus as he might behave when we're put on the spot flows out of us easily, right? Does that make sense? Comes out of us easily. That's part of what easy yoke means, that when we begin to practice the way of Jesus, what actually happens is that the person of Jesus comes out of us easily, almost automatically. That's part of what he means by that. Willard writes, Dallas Willard, how can we be like Christ always? Not as a pose or a performance or by a constant and grinding effort. Doesn't it feel like becoming like Jesus sometimes feels like constant grinding effort? Anybody ever feel that way? Well, how do we become like Jesus in a way that it's not a pose or by a constant grinding effort, but how do we do it with the ease and power he had, flowing from the inner depths, aching with quiet force from the innermost mind and soul of the Christ who's become a real part of us? This is our vocation and highest good. This is part of what Jesus means when he's saying easy yoke. It's supposed to flow out of you easily. That the life of Christ, our hope for every one of you is that the life of Christ would flow out of you with ease and power, as Willard is talking about. That it wouldn't be constant and grinding effort. If you think about this for a moment, it makes sense. So I grew up playing classical violin. If you're Asian, that's probably not surprising. But I grew up playing classical violin, right? It taught me something invaluable. Like when I got to a difficult passage in a piece, how could I play it in a way that was almost effortless, in a way that almost like I didn't have to think about it? Like some of you are athletes or some of you who are musicians know this, right? You know that the constant practice, all of a sudden when you get on the field, you do things automatically. You do things with ease and power, right? Chris is a college football player. Chris was a college football player, but you know what I'm talking about, right? With practice, the things that you practice come out of you almost automatically, right? If we want to take on the easy yoke, it's actually hard. It takes a lot of practice. And what do you practice? Well, you practice the spiritual habits that we've been talking about. You do the spiritual practices that we've been talking about. That's what you do. What you do is you continually practice the spiritual habits so that what comes out of you when you are pressed or when you are squeezed becomes the person of Jesus. Like I grew up with a really, really bad temper. I mean, really bad. I mean, like fly off the handle bad. I mean, like I get into arguments with people when I was younger. I mean, I get into arguments with people on the phone. Like, hey, here's my internet. Like I'm going to get in an argument with this person. Like I'm spoiling for a fight. I mean, like I had a really, really bad temper. When Brittany and I got married 17 years ago, my temper was not helpful, as you can imagine. About 10 years into our marriage, I remember looking at Brittany and saying, I'm not that angry anymore, am I? And she said, no, you're not actually. You're more annoying. But no, I'm just kidding. She didn't say that. You're just as annoying, but you're not as angry anymore. That's not a real conversation. She's very kind and gracious, It's just kind of how things go in my head. Anyway, actually, she said, no, actually, you're not. What changed? And I have no other answer than, I had no other answer. I had no answer to that question other than that I'd just been doing spiritual practices. I mean, I'd given my life to doing spiritual practices. I was like spending time with Jesus in the morning, like large amounts of time with Jesus in the morning. I would pray, I would read scripture, I would memorize large swaths of Jesus' sayings. I mean, I was doing those practices, I was living those practices out, right? And all of a sudden, it was the leaning in every day for 10 years. All of a sudden, what started to happen was when I started to get squeezed in moments where I'd feel like I want to get angry, I couldn't help it. The person of Jesus would come out more. I'm not saying I'm perfect, by the way. I'm not saying that I never get angry. I'm still in process. I'm just saying that the giving of ourselves over to these practices actually can change us. It may take a long time, but it can change us. And I'm also not saying don't get help. I mean, it would have been really helpful for me to go and get therapy. It would have probably been really helpful for me to go and get help. I'm not saying don't do that. I'm saying doing that, getting help, and then also working these spiritual practices can really change. And they can flow out of you. The person of Jesus can flow out of you with ease and power. That's what we want for you. So that's part of what it means to be the easy yoke. The third thing that I think he's saying, the last thing that we want you to notice about the easy yoke is it's so easier than the world. Ease of flow is the second thing. And the third thing that we want you to notice about the yoke is that it's easy with. So what's a yoke? It's a wooden crosspiece, right? And it's a wooden crosspiece that is fastened over the necks of how many animals? Just one? No, two, right? I mean, the secret of the easy yoke is that the easy yoke is supposed to be together. We're supposed to do it with other people. Does the easy yoke actually mean that we're yoked with Jesus, that we're yoked with the power and the spirit that he gives us? Yes, absolutely. But I think it means more than that. I think it means that the easy yoke that we are supposed to carry is meant to be a burden that we share together as a community. I think it's meant to be a communal metaphor for you and me, We are meant to practice the way of Jesus with one another. So a lot of times when we think about spiritual formation or discipleship, we think, yeah, that's something I do to take care of myself. We think about it as an individual practice, right? But that's not actually what Jesus is saying. Jesus is saying, no. The yoke is easy, partly because you're carrying it with one another in community, right? If I become like Jesus and my neighbor doesn't become like Jesus, we're not really living out the value of becoming like Jesus. So what does it look like for an entire church to give itself to practicing the way of Jesus together? Well, here's our intention. Our hope is that in the next few years, we will develop a rule of life for our church. So what does a rule of life mean? Well, a rule of life, the C.S. Lewis Institute defines a rule of life this way. A rule of life is an intentional pattern of spiritual practices or disciplines that provide structure and direction for growth in Jesus or in holiness. A rule establishes a rhythm for life in which is helpful for being formed by the Spirit, a rhythm that reflects a love for God and respect for how he's made us. I mean, this is not a new concept, by the way. Monks have been practicing rules of life for centuries. Have anybody ever heard of a rule of life? Anybody? Is that knowledge? Is that familiar? It's just a list, essentially, of practices, the spiritual practices, but also including things like activity, like recreation, clothing, food. Like it's a rule that encompasses all of life because all of life is found in God, right? So it's a rule of life, and it's written down, and it's agreed upon by members of a community together. So our intention is to build one of those rules together and to practice them together. So we're going to have a rule of life for the Evanston Vineyard, and we're all going to practice it together. Does that make sense? That's what we're going to do. That's our intention. Now, it's actually pretty voguish right now in some churches to adopt rules of life. So if you've been in a church for a while, you may have heard, let's do a rule of life. And so everybody goes off on their own. They write their own rule, and then they come back and they may share it with their small group or share it with the community. And then they go off and they do it. And then after a while, they stop doing it. Anybody have that experience? I've had that experience before. Wrote my rule, thought it was really exciting, then went off, tried to do it, and then stopped doing it. And then nobody asked me, are you still doing that rule? That's not our intention. By the way, rules of life aren't meant to be practiced like that. Rules of life are meant to be practiced together as a community. And so you might be wondering, well, what's that rule? Do we have that rule yet? And the answer is no, we don't. We don't have it yet. Our intention is to write that rule together. So if you're interested in helping to write that rule, did you get out your Connect card and write down, hey, I'm interested in helping come up with that rule. This rule, by the way, will be how we think about living together as a community and how we think about following Jesus together. I know it's kind of hard for me to describe this without showing you actually what a rule looks like. But if you're interested in it, just let us know on the Connect card. Our intention, maybe you could just take away from this message this, though. Our intention is as a church together, we want to become like Jesus together. Does that make sense? So this is not something where I'm saying, hey, I'm the pastor, and I just want to tell you, hey, Katie Ray, your job, become like Jesus. So go ahead and do that, and then come back and report how it's going. No, that's not how we intend for it to be. We intend for the rule of life to be more like a river rather than like you go off on a journey and climb a mountain by yourself. Does that make sense? So when we think about rule of life, we want us to all be in the river together, going down with the current together. Does that make sense? We don't want it to say like, okay, there's the mountain, go climb it. We know it's probably impossible and you're going to need oxygen, and most people don't make it. And they die before they get to the top anyway. No, that's not. Our intention is for it to feel like a river flowing into the ocean of God's mercy for us. All right? And so if you're interested in helping us write that rule, put that down in your Connect card. This is our value. Our hope for us is that we become like Jesus. And if you're thinking like, wait, so what's the takeaway for this message? The takeaway for this message is you're going to write a rule and you're going to come and talk to us about it in 2 or 3 years. Great. Well, if you're wondering, well, what can I do right now? Our invitation to you is you can begin to become like Jesus right now. How do you do that? Well, you can go back and listen, re-listen if you haven't, if you've already listened to our spiritual practices message series that we did this summer. Take one of those practices, begin to practice it. Tell somebody that you're practicing it. That's one thing that you can do. Another thing that you can do is you can go and pick up this book. This book is called The Deeply Formed Life. It's written by a Latino pastor in Queens who leads a church that's very much like ours, very similar to ours. This is a great book. You could pick this up. You could start reading it. Tell somebody that you're reading it. Actually, if you look at the QR code, you can, Ben Sayuni, one of our pastoral interns, if you just look at the QR code, he put the link for the book in the QR code. So if you click on that, there's a link there. You can grab that book. You can do that as well. You're going to be hearing more about this, so this is not the last time that we've talked about this subject. We want you to take on the yoke of Jesus, which is easier than the yoke of the world, which means that there will be the ease of flow as you become squeezed and put on the spot as Jesus flows out of your inner being, and also the easy yoke that is meant to be a yoke that we carry together.